Hi, I'm Terry Stroman. Welcome to another Woodsmith Seminar podcast. We're really glad to see so many woodworkers joining us in this new medium. It's an exciting way for us to bring woodworking information to you. If you're new to our content, what you'll see is a recording of a live seminar that a Woodsmith Magazine staff member gave at the Woodsmith store in Des Moines, Iowa. It's just like the detailed content you'll find in Woodsmith Magazine. See for yourself. Go to woodsmith.com and get a free issue. You'll find all the projects, tips, and techniques you need to make you a better woodworker. One of our most popular seminars is the one that Jim Downing has given several times on how to set up your shop. You'll hear some innovative ideas about how to make the most of whatever space you have. Jim's a senior designer and he's got a great presentation. So let's get started.
Okay, what we'll be talking about tonight is small shop planning, and the emphasis is on strategies for saving space. No matter what size your shop is, it always gets too small before too long. So even big shops can benefit from space-saving strategies. So we'll get started here. We'll be talking about the critical clearances required to operate the different pieces of equipment and how to integrate that into your shop planning. We'll talk about mobile tool bases, how to move heavy pieces of equipment around, which makes the flexibility of a shop much better. It gives you the ability to change your shop around as need be. And we'll talk about some space-saving cabinetry that we use to increase the space of the shop. And we'll talk about some shop organizers that utilize the walls. And finally, we'll talk about dust collection, kind of the difference between shop vacs and dust collectors, and when a shop vac is better than the dust collector, and when the dust collector is king. Okay, we'll start with a little shop here that's about 16 by 20, and we've got a wide open space to work with. The heart of most woodworking shops is the table saw, so we'll have one delivered here to our shop. Most people think about putting the table saw in the center of the shop. In a larger shop, that's not a bad idea because it gives it a lot of clearance and room to operate. But in a small shop, I've found that it actually is better to put it along one wall, put the right wing against one wall, because you can still get most of the use out of the saw. If you have a mobile base, of course, you can move it away from the wall to increase its capacity. But for a small shop, as we'll see, it's going to work pretty good for us. Okay, when we locate our tools, we got to think about the amount of space that it's going to take to operate the tool. It takes more space for the function of the tool than it does for the actual tool itself. I've brought in a piece of plywood here that's about 24 by 8 feet long, just to show an example. We'll go ahead and rip the board here. We rip it in two, and magically the kerf closes right back up. But it does demonstrate the amount of space that it takes. And that space is starting to create what I call a material handling zone. This is an area that you have to avoid in placing equipment for the rest of the planning. So once we start creating this material handling zone, we've got to stay clear of that area with other tools or share that area if need be. I'll show you what I'm talking about there. Okay, we do more than just rip with a table saw. We also cross cut. We'll take that same piece of plywood and we'll make our cut. And as you can see here, we've increased the size of that material handling zone. So now we know that we need to stay clear of that area when we start bringing in more pieces of equipment. So we've got our table saw. One strategy to save space is to bring in tools that will utilize that same material handling zone. For example, here you can see I've brought in a router table. I've added it to the left extension wing of the table saw, and when we use that machine now, we'll go ahead and rip a board. You'll see that it's operating within that same zone. So we haven't increased that material handling zone at all. So we've got two tools in the same amount of space at this point. Okay, next tool we'll bring in is a miter saw. As you can see, it's over here against the wall. And we'll position it where it's high enough that the wood that we're cutting with the miter saw, as you can see right here, that it's above the top of the table saw. So we're sharing some space there again. And then we'll have to allow some space on the right-hand side of the miter saw. So what we've done is we've increased that material handling zone by a little bit, but not much. Okay, so we've got three tools set up here. Let's go ahead and bring in another basic piece of equipment for wood preparation, and that's the thickness sander, or excuse me, a thickness planer. And again, we've mounted it on a cart where the wood that we're planing goes out over the top of the saw. So we've done our planing operation in that same space that we had established before. So now we have four major pieces of equipment sharing that same space. We'll go ahead and park it out of the way here. What I'm doing here with moving this planer around is we've built a mobile base for it, and we'll see that a little later, that folds down. Okay, the next piece of equipment that's very important to basic wood preparation is a joiner. And right now we'll just park it over here against the wall until we need it. So when we need to use the tool, again, it's on a mobile base. And I was telling you earlier, mobile bases are critical to making small shops work big. That way we don't have to leave the planer setting out in the middle of the room the entire time. We can roll it out of the way when it needs to be. And again, we'll do our little wood cutting demonstration here, run a board across the planer. And you'll notice that it did use some space up over here, so what's going to happen, that did increase our material handling zone somewhat, but not a lot. It still gives us quite a bit of space to start moving in additional pieces of shop equipment. Put it back against the wall. Okay, so that's our total material handling zone for those major pieces of equipment. So now we can start planning the shop from there. This is an example of the table saw that I was talking about earlier. It has the router table is mounted in the left-hand wing. There's a lot of advantages to that. One, this particular one has its own fence, but you can use the saw's fence as well for a lot of the cutting operations. This saw also has a mobile base under it, which is manufactured specifically for this saw. You can order bases to fit whatever kind of piece of equipment that you have, or you can order custom bases as well. You can also make your own custom bases. They do have kits for mobile bases that the kit supplies the metal parts and the wheels and everything, and you supply the wooden parts. So that way you can make the base any size that you want to fit whatever tool that you need. The work stand that you see here is a project that came from Workbench Magazine, and that's available online. It's just a work support that folds up and is adjustable, lightweight, stores out of the way. This is a mobile, not really a mobile base, but it's a way to move your saw around without having a mobile base, and it's simply a angled block of wood bolted to the legs of the table saw with a pair of casters attached, and you just simply lift up on this end and push the saw. So it's just a simple little mobile idea. This is a shop tip that came from Woodsmith magazine. Okay, this is an example of that space-saving cabinetry that I'd talked about. And what we've done here, we've just gone to the Home Center, Home Depot, or wherever and bought some factory-made cabinets and set them in place. But rather than buy the lower cabinets that are 24 inches deep, we bought upper cabinets that are only 12 inches deep. And actually the 12-inch depth is actually pretty nice for tools because you can park them in there on those shelves without hiding other pieces of equipment behind. So it does a couple things. It's a good practical storage for the shop, saves some space at the same time, and we just set those cabinets on a wooden base made out of 2x4s, and then we made our own top. And we'll see this thing in use here in just a bit. Okay, this is the cabinetry that I used to accomplish what we looked at first, locating the table saw and the miter saw and the planer and all of those things. And again, it's just factory cabinets sitting here. We made our own bases and made some tops and made some end panels out here on the ends to support the work tables. And we've got a table here in the center that's installed between the two for the miter saw. So there you see it set up with the miter saw, and that gives you a lot of support for cutting long work pieces on both sides. Let's go ahead and bring before we bring in the table saw, there is another idea here to look at, and that's using that space right below the miter saw for a trash bin for cut-offs and everything. The idea here is to utilize all the space as efficiently as possible. Okay, there's our table saw in place. It's parked underneath that left-hand wing on the miter saw station, and we've got a portion of the saw underneath of the miter saw work surfaces that you normally don't use a lot. Most of your woodworking projects, you're really not ripping that wide of material. So for the most part, this arrangement works pretty nice. But again, it's on a mobile base, and if you need more capacity out of your saw, you can roll the saw out as need be. And again, you see the miter table on the left-hand side of the saw. Okay, we'll bring in that planer, and here you can see it mounted on a plywood cart, and it has wheels with locking casters. The locking casters are important so it's not rolling all around, and it's set up at a height that when the wood comes out of the planer, it goes over the top of the saw. You don't want it to be exactly the same height of the saw. It's better if it's a few inches above the saw, so there's no chance of it catching or anything. And this stand is made where it folds up, and I'll show you a source online where you can get the plans for that. So when you're done using it, you fold the planer down, then you can park it underneath the bench. And now you've got a nice compact workstation that does a lot of work without taking up a lot of space. Let's get back to the shop here. We see that the workstation that we just developed is in place. So it's time to go ahead and start planning the rest of the shop. We'll bring in a workbench, and as you can see here, I've moved it into place and I've not put it over any of those green areas. So we're still able to use all the machines like we had originally planned. It's a good idea to stop and think every once in a while, make sure you got enough clearances. So I created a little Weeble man here to walk through the shop, make sure we got room. And as you can see here, he's not making it through all the way. So we need to work on that and move the bench down here a little bit. Now we can get on through. So usually when you're planning your shop, you want to keep a couple feet between each piece of equipment for clearance. It's if you have at least that amount, you should be able to move through there pretty easily. 3 feet's better, but 2 feet will work fine too, especially if you have a small shop to work with. Okay, Woodsmith store just delivered a new stationary sander. We'll park it over there, out of the green zone. Bring in our drill press. Bring in a bandsaw. I've got all these tools outside of that material handling zone. We'll put a scroll saw over here in the corner now. It's kind of setting out into the ways, but it's light enough that you can pivot it over into the corner where it's out of the way. Okay, I brought in some more shallow cabinets over here against this wall, some lower cabinets and upper cabinets. I like to have a workbench that's out in the open, kind of like you see here, that where you can get around all sides of it. It works a lot better than a stationary bench against the wall, because you have a tendency to pile stuff on it. So you need to have a bench that you can keep it clear, and so that's why you need another bench that's nearby that you can pile all your stuff on it, because I mean there's no getting around it. You've got to pile that stuff someplace, you know. If you're like me, you don't put everything away as you use it and then get it all back out. I stack it up until it gets dangerous, and then I start putting it away then later. But you do have to have those work surfaces to work with, and you want to keep that main workbench clear all the time. Okay, let's do one more walkthrough here with our Weeble guy. Make sure we've got all our clearances. My editor thought this was kind of a goofy little presentation thing, but some people worry about those things, I guess. Especially this part. He thought this was kind of goofy, but the guy's happy. You know, and hey, if you're happy in your shop, then that's a good thing. Okay, one of the strategies that works every time in saving space is using the walls. And as you can see, I've brought in a lumber rack over here along the wall. When you locate your lumber rack, it's a good thing to have it near the door where you can put your stuff in place right away. If it's over here in the corner someplace, you're going to be catching corners of tools and stuff and damaging plywood and this and that. So near the door is a good location. This is an example of a lumber rack just exactly like I had shown there. It's got the lumber up above and sheet goods down below, and that's just using a heavy-duty shelving system from the home centers. A lot of the books that we have show a lot of different ways to making your own, so if you want to make your own, that's good too. Very often cutting sheets of plywood is a difficult thing for one person to do in a shop on a table saw. So what we're going to talk about here a little bit is a space-saving strategies that is used in Europe quite a bit. And the idea there is to, rather than push the material across a stationary machine where you have to have all of this material handling zone, the idea is that you do all your work and all your machining in one spot. So rather than moving the plywood across the tool, the idea here is that you move the tool across the plywood. And what this is this aluminum guide that just guides the saw. This saw fits right on it. You just place the edge of it right up to the line where you're going to cut, and that's where it cuts. And you can get these straight edges and 8 foot long and longer. And you can also make these things. You can make them out of thin plywood and a straight edge along one side and use your circular saw. One advantage of this particular saw is that it's extremely accurate. Actually, I have one in my shop, and when I'm cutting good quality plywoods, I actually use this saw instead of the table saw because it's more accurate, more splinter free. It actually does a better job. Plus, my shop is in the basement, so I've got dust to be worried about. So it has a good dust extraction system. So the idea is to move the tool across the workpiece. You can do the same thing with a router that runs on a straight edge as well. We'll go ahead and demonstrate that here in our shop. I'm going to back up a couple slides here. I want to show you this table. What it is just a bunch of 1x4s put together in kind of an egg crate. So with folding legs so it stores out of the way, and when you need to use it to cut on, you can put your plywood or boards or whatever right on it, set the saw blade where it just cuts a little ways through the stock, and it actually cuts into the table a little bit. But that's okay. I mean, it's just cutting some notches in there. It's not a problem. So, and again, that's a project that's in Workbench that's available. You can build it yourself. So let's go ahead and bring it into our shop here. So the idea is we've set our table up here, and then we can bring a piece of plywood out of the lumber rack and throw it up onto the table to cut it. But as you can see here, we've got some clearance problems here and there and there. There's not hardly room to get in there and work. So again, this is where those mobile bases come in. We'll move some of this stuff out of the way. Go ahead and slide the table and the plywood up. And then we can come in here with the long straight edge, rip our sheet goods, and then of course use a shorter straight edge like you see here, make our cross cuts. So that's a good way to work with big pieces of plywood and stuff in a small shop, especially if you're short-handed. It's a lot easier to handle. Move things back. Okay, again, Utilizing the walls is a great way to save space. This is a little cabinet that mounts on the wall near the drill press. We'll locate it right there. This is another little project that was in the magazine that stores your portable and cordless tools. And a clamp rack mounts on the wall, keeps everything close at hand and out of the way. And as you can see here, I've mounted the clamp rack where it's close to the workbench. So when you're assembling your projects, you can grab the clamps easily. So you do want to think about, the process that you go through and bringing the wood in, cutting it up, and then assembling it. And of course, one thing that a lot of folks forget is that you need a space big enough to assemble the project. So in this particular shop, that's pretty much it here, and maybe some over in this area, where you can actually put your projects together if you're building a dresser or a cabinet or something like that. You do have to have room to place those in there. Again, these are just typical little projects like you'll find in these shop planning books. Okay, now I talked a little bit about dust collection earlier. We'll start with the shop vac, and we'll bring it in, and we'll kind of tuck it underneath our workbench right here. Typically, shop vacs are used for handheld tools, kind of like you see the saw connected there, or a router, or different kinds of sanders and stuff. That's where a shop vac works. Shop vacs work well with these small hoses, high velocity, where it catches the dust like it should. Whereas the big dust collectors, if you try to hook those to a small hose, they just don't have the static pressure to work properly on small hoses. So you need to keep those connected to the larger diameter hoses. Probably nothing any smaller than 3-inch, and 4-inch is actually best for most applications. So the shop vac works good for those smaller tools, and the dust collector works great for the big table saws and thickness planers and sanders, and that's those sorts of pieces of equipment. One thing to consider when you're locating your dust collector is to keep it near where the thickness planer is located, because the thickness planer creates the toughest dust for the planer to handle, because there's a lot of material coming out of a thickness planer. So the closer you are to the dust collector, the better. So we'll see that in an example here. Back to the shop vac. One of the problems that happen here, you got the shop vac set up, you got your router hooked up to it on the table, or your sander or something. I inevitably tend to catch my foot on the hose and drop the tool on the floor, and using the hose to drag the tool right out onto the floor. So here's a little shop tip from Workbench Magazine, where they just cable tied a little wire basket onto the shop vac. So when you're done with your sander, instead of leaving it on the bench, just put it in that little bin, and it's safe and sound, and when you're ready to use it, it's there. This is an example of a dust collector like the two that you see over here. Again, those are for high volumes of dust, and we'll go ahead and locate that over here in the corner of the shop, which is typically a pretty good place to put it. Go ahead and hook up our first run of pipe, and we'll run over to the miter saw. Another thing that you're not seeing here is that when the planer is in place, you can disconnect the miter saw and then hook the dust collection to the to the thickness planer. So that puts the planer close to the dust collector, as you see there. Okay, we'll continue our piping on over here to the table saw, and then out and over the top. And by that I mean an overhead collector. I've found that table saws, collecting the dust from the table saw works best when you collect it on the top rather than on the bottom side. Now, if you're cutting dados or something like that, where the blade is only on the bottom side of the saw, then the hose that hooks to the bottom side of the saw works pretty good. But mostly, for most projects, most operations, it works best to collect the dust from the top. As a matter of fact, we just finished building a project like that, and I think that's going to be in Shop Notes. Yeah, in an upcoming issue of Shop Notes on how to build your own like this, and they really did a cool job on it. So rather than spending a lot of money out here, you can build your own. You can tell I'm from editorial and not sales, right? But that's one of the reasons we get into woodworking, is building our own stuff, and that's part of the fun. And so we'll look at one more type of dust collector, and that's up here on the ceiling. It's like these units right up here. What these things do is it just sucks the air in one side and blows it out the other, and on the way through there's a filter. So it's got a pre-filter on one end that gets the big stuff, and it's got a real fine filter on the other side that gets the fine stuff. And that's the stuff that gets around in your house if your shop's in the basement, and that's the stuff that gets in your lungs. So this is cleaning the air. So that is a very important consideration in planning your shop. So you want to locate these near your worst offenders, and I've put it here next to the table saw. And the idea here is that the air goes through it and then circulates, probably doesn't go outside the walls, circulates around through the shop and back, picking up dust-laden air on its way around. So that's the three different kinds of dust collectors: the high-velocity shop vac for the small portable tools, the dust collectors for table saws and big stationary tools, and the air filter that cleans the air that you breathe. So that's the PowerPoint part of this. I do want to show you a couple other things here. We'll go to Workbench Magazine's website. Okay. And we'll scroll down here to Home Shop. That's workbenchmagazine.com. And this has got a ton of stuff on several different shops that Workbench has done, and that leads you through all the various shops, and a bunch of projects that you can build, shop planning, as well as some different workstations over here. This is kind of cool because it's an interactive shop planner that you can set this up to fit the size of your shop. It shows the dimensions down here. For example, we'll go to that 16 by... Yeah, well, anyway, you can set up your shop any size you want. And then you can come over here and you can get a hold of these same tools that you saw in the demonstration earlier, and you can locate them right here in the shop, just like we talked about. Bring a workbench out here, set it up, and you just scroll through all of the various tools, and you'll see all of those pieces that I used in that presentation. You can just bring all of those things out here and set them in place and just kind of work out your shop ideas. And it's got a grid where every square is a foot, so you can kind of measure out those clearances that we talked about. Then when you're all done, you just hit the print and head down to the shop and see if it works. There'll probably be some fine tuning. The question was, how much electrical capacity do you need for a one-person shop, for example? Well, that's probably the key to my answer. It's a one-person shop, and you're only using one or two tools at a time. For example, you might be running the table saw and the dust collector, and very often I'll have the table saw and the joiner running at the same time, because I'll rip a board and then I'll walk over to the joiner and joint off one edge where it's nice and square. Then I'll come back and rip the next board. So I've got 3 pieces of equipment running at the same time. So usually 3 or 4 circuits, 20 amp circuits in a shop is adequate. Whenever you can use 220, like with dust collectors and table saws and some of the bigger tools, that's more efficient. So I would recommend using 220 when you can, but right, yeah. So I used to have a shop that had a 60 amp main panel in it, which seems really small by today's standards, but I had air compressor kicking on every once in a while and dust collection running, and I got along just fine using 60 amps of power. But okay, the question was, how do you collect dust off of a lathe? I didn't talk about a lathe, and a lathe is a very difficult tool to collect dust from, or to collect shavings from. And a dust collector works better for that with a 4-inch hose and some kind of enlarged hood, and it has to be located right next to what you're turning to collect the shavings. And even then, it's not going to collect all of them. So it's one of those tools that defies the dust collector. And unless you're sanding, the shavings that it's kicking off aren't the type of dust. It's not dust. If your tools are sharp, it's shaving it off in shavings. So it's not something that you could breathe or is going to float around in the room. If you do come back and sand, you're going to get dust from that. So that is important to have dust collection, as well as breathing protection, which is important for a lot of these pieces of equipment, even with proper air circulation and everything. So yeah, it's a tough one. The question is, where do you put the TV in the refrigerator? Well, with some of the videos and things now, the TV probably would be kind of nice, but you're probably going to put, if you have any kind of TV, it probably is going to be in some kind of cabinet where you can close it up,
Could it be a fire hazard, seriously, a TV?
Oh, no, I think the whole idea, just keeping the dust out of the thing. Well, the question is concrete block walls and how to deal with that in attaching cabinetry and those sorts of things on the wall, whether you should fur the wall out, so you could attach things to it. And that is, actually, that's a good solution, is to put some furring on the wall and put plywood, or some people even use this flake board on the walls. So, But the whole idea is that using plywood on the walls, you can attach jig holders or cabinets or any of that any way you want. In my particular shop, the cabinets are held on the wall using plastic anchors and screws. And any open wall space, most of it has pegboard, just furred out strips with pegboard on the wall, so to hang things on. The question was, what size of a dust collector do you need? And probably the answer is to check with I'm not sure what the CFMs are on this exactly. I would check with the guys out here on capacities. But one thing to consider is that you could have your system piped in with blast gates at each tool, and the idea is that you keep the system closed off and then you open up the system to one tool at a time, and that way you've got full capacity of the dust collector drawing dust from that one particular tool. So that's one way to make a smaller dust collector do the job. I know in my shop the dust collector I'm using is about the size of this small General over here. The question is how small or how big should your workbench be? This is a pretty typical size. I know my workbench is 5 feet long and it's about 20 inches deep is all the depth of it, and it seems to be adequate for most everything that I do on it. I do have one of those cutting tables like I showed you earlier for cutting plywood on. Once in a while I'll get that out and I'll set some plywood on the top where I can set some larger projects on that, for general assembly. But the workbench itself doesn't have to be that big. Depends a lot on the kind of projects you're building. Yeah, I don't know the technical answer to that. The question was, how big of an air filter system should you have? How many CFMs? Again, you'd have to check with the guys here at the store on those recommendations. The question was, do I have a preference on lighting? Fluorescent lighting is usually pretty good. I like to use the daylight corrected fluorescent tubes. They're called daylight bulbs, and the idea there is it gives you true colors. So when you're staining and finishing like that, what you see is what you're going to get. Because sometimes, when you do a project and you bring it out of the shop and you actually set it in the living room where there's light streaming in from the side and stuff like that, you see things that you wish you would have saw. Along that same line, that light streaming in from the side, I like to set up, when I'm sanding a project, I like to set up one of those contractors' lights, construction lights, over here where it kind of washes across the workbench. And then when you're sanding and stuff, you can see, if you get that light raking across the workpiece, you can see imperfections a lot clearer. And those are the imperfections that you'll see when you take the project up into the living room where there's a little more outdoor light coming in. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. As always, Woodsmith Woodworking Seminars are brought to you by Woodsmith Magazine. So go to woodsmith.com and get yourself a free issue.
Safety is your responsibility. In some instances, the guards and safety equipment are left off some machines during the woodworking seminars. This is done for clarity. We strongly suggest you always use all of the safety equipment that come with your tools. August Home Publishing Company does not assume any responsibility for any injury, damage, or loss suffered as a result of your actions based on the operations shown in this podcast.